Hello and welcome to our video about Paul's first letter to Timothy. Now that we finished the letters to the churches, we continue with the so-called pastoral letters, the two letters of Timothy and the letter to Titus. These are not epistles to churches, but letters to persons, collaborators of the Apostle Paul. In the background here, we have pictures of the excavations of Ephesus. At the time Timothy received the letter, he was working there for Paul. And again, we ask three questions. The first question, who was Timothy? The second question, why did Paul write this first letter to Timothy? And the third question is, does the content of this letter still apply to us? The first question, who was Timothy? When on his first journey, Paul came to the area of Iconium, Lystra and Derbe, he met Timothy for the first time. At that time, Timothy was a young man. He met Paul, and this man impressed him greatly. Not only his words, but also his behavior, his faith, and his love impressed him. You can read it in 2 Timothy 3, verse 10. This young man, Timothy, was the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother. His grandmother also was a devout Jewish woman. When Paul came to this area for the second time, sometime later, he invited Timothy to join him on his second missionary journey. It is interesting to see how at first Timothy was just Paul's helper. That was the first stage in their collaboration. Then the two of them worked side by side. Later, Paul sent Timothy to carry out tasks for him. For example, he sent him to Thessalonica because he could not go there himself. In the end, Timothy worked independently, for example, in Ephesus, as described in this letter. Doesn't this exemplify beautiful growth in faith, a model for all of us? But even more beautiful is the testimony Paul gave of him in the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. For I have no one like-minded who will naturally care for your estate. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Jesus Christ. But you know the proof of him, that as a son with his father, he has served with me in the gospel. The second question, why did Paul write this first letter to Timothy? The answer to this question can easily be found in chapter 3, verse 15. This I write to you in the hope that soon I will come to you. But if I hesitate, that you may know how to behave in the house of God, which is the assembly of the living God. So it's all about our behavior in the church of God. Now, when Paul had traveled on after his stay in Ephesus, he had left Timothy there to put things in order. There were problems in the local church. And let us be honest, in which church do you not find problems? Through this letter, Timothy received guidelines for his work in the church. I'm so glad that Paul wrote this letter because here we also find guidelines for our own church today. My third question is, does the content of this letter still apply to us? The following observation I find interesting. Paul wrote this letter not as a private person, but as apostle of Jesus Christ, according to the commandment of God, chapter 1, verse 1, and as the teacher of the nations, chapter 2, verse 7. Imagine, God had appointed him as an apostle. I therefore believe that what he wrote must be taken seriously, even today. In chapter 4, we find the warning that a time is coming, it says in later days, when people no longer want to listen to these orders. They would fall away from the faith, that is, the doctrine of the faith. And how much did this come to be true. For how often this question is still being asked today. What does God say about such and such matter or subject? Even in Christian churches. Well, what is this letter about? In chapter 2 we read about our prayer meetings, and then the behavior of man in those meetings, and then the behavior of women in the church. Then chapter 3 deals with characteristics of an elder, characteristics of a deacon. The church is the church of the living God, therefore it needs leadership. Without leadership, people will perish. That's what the Proverbs say. We cannot just do what we want. Chapter 5 then deals with older and younger men, then widows, and how do elders function, and what do we have to do if they sin. Then in chapter 6 there are important teachings about slaves, or today's employees in companies, because these are at present the servants or slaves. Finally, it's all about money. Among other things, one can find the answer to the question, can a Christian be rich? Timothy was given the task of teaching all this. Paul called this doctrine the healthy doctrine, chapter 1, verse 10, or the healthy words, chapter 6, verse 3. It was the doctrine that is after godliness. That is the answer to the question, how can I serve God well? And this is actually the most important question in Christian life. How can I serve God well? For godliness is a translation of the Greek eusebeia, which is literally you, that's good, and zebeia, that's service. Please do check what this looks like in your life. What does it look like in your church? Until next time, then we continue with the second letter to Timothy, God willing. Until then, may God bless you.